I had a 12-gauge shotgun pointed at the sky, Karen was screaming about federal law, and a flaming drone crashed into the side of my barn. All because the HOA thought they could hijack my ranch for their shiny new solar panels. What they didn't know. My great-grandfather prepared for this moment 100 years ago, and it was about to blow up in their faces. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait, what? How do you even pull that off legally? And how does she not notice? That's the best part. Karen didn't notice because, like most self-declared suburban tyrants with a law degree from Facebook and a God complex fed by HOA bylaws, she assumed everyone outside her picket-fenced kingdom was just another hick with a shotgun and a cow named Betsy. Which, to be fair, is only half true. My shotgun is named Loretta, and I haven't had a cow named Betsy since the late 90s. But what I do have is 140 acres of legally protected, strategically defended, and hilariously underestimated family land, and a whole lot of time. This all started 3 weeks before that drone took a nosedive into my siding and started a barn fire that took me and my cousin Dale 2 hours to stamp out with wet feed sack. That morning, I found a group of guys in safety vests surveying near the eastern fence line. I rolled up on my ATV and asked what they were doing. One of them smiled like I'd just brought him a coffee and said, "Just prepping the install site for the solar expansion, sir. Should be done in a week or 2. I blinked. Expansion for what? He glanced at a clipboard. For the HOA solar grid. New initiative. Going green. I stared at him. Then I stared past him, at the neatly cut orange boundary markers and the little pink flags fluttering in the wind like they belonged there. They were 20 feet onto my property. I wasn't in any mood to escalate that early in the morning, so I nodded, told them I'd be back, and drove straight to the HOA office. Now, let me clarify something. I don't live in the HOA. I live next to it. My land butts up against the eastern edge of Pine Ridge Estates, a collection of overpriced stucco boxes with 2-car garages, suspiciously identical flower beds, and an obsession with uniformity so intense it makes military barracks look like Burning Man. The HOA charter was formed 10 years ago, long after I inherited the ranch. They've tried to annex parts of my land before, claiming misaligned property borders and historical variance issues. I shot that down real quick. Literally. With boundary posts and legal filings. But they never tried anything like this. Inside the HOA office, I was greeted by Karen herself. Technically her name is Madeline, but she introduced herself with, "I'm the HOA president, and we'll be needing your signature to finalize our energy sharing arrangement." She smiled like we were best friends swapping casserole recipes. I told her no. She blinked. I elaborated. "No, you're not installing anything on my land. No, you didn't ask. No, I won't sign anything." She frowned like I'd just kicked her golden retriever. "Mr. Callahan, I don't think you understand the opportunity we're offering. This is a sustainable energy solution. It benefits the whole community." I told her my barn and my land weren't part of her whole community. She actually did that slow inhale thing people do in courtroom dramas when they're about to say something really stupid. The HOA board voted. "We have the right to use adjacent, unzoned land for community benefit. You'll barely notice it's there." I replied, "That's funny, because I barely noticed it's yours." What followed was a flurry of emails, mailers, and even a glossy pamphlet that featured my eastern field photoshopped with sparkling solar panels. They mailed it to every house in Pine Ridge and posted it on the HOA's Facebook group, which I was kindly not invited to. They were holding informational sessions and taking selfies in front of future solar innovation zones that were actually my hayfield. At first, I laughed. But then they started bringing in equipment. Trucks. Cement posts. Wiring. They installed junction boxes inside my fence line. That's when I stopped laughing. I sent an official cease and desist letter through my lawyer, Donna. She's 73, wears floral blouses, and once threatened to sue the city when they repaved her street without notice. Karen ignored it. Instead, she began sending her little drone over my ranch every morning and evening. At first, I figured it was just a hobby, until I noticed it hovering over my barns, dipping close to the livestock pens, even peeking through windows. That's when I checked the HOA Facebook group using a burner account and found her post, monitoring ongoing encroachments and animal safety hazards. Video documentation in progress. That little flying narc had to go. So that's how we ended up at the moment I had Loretta aimed skyward. The drone buzzed low, barely 20 feet above my driveway, and Karen stood on the other side of the property line, phone in hand, filming. She was shouting about airspace rights and federal regulations. I smiled, waved, and blew that drone out of the sky like it was a clay pigeon. It sparked, spun, and nosedived into the barn wall with a satisfying crunch and a puff of smoke. Karen screamed like I'd just shot her dog. I turned and walked back to my porch like it was just another Wednesday morning. Of course, she called the FAA. I called my lawyer. What Karen didn't realize, and here's the real kicker, is that her drone had broken at least 3 state-level drone privacy laws, crossed over livestock zones protected by agricultural safety regulations, and had been flying under 50 feet for days. I had footage, timestamps, and a very irritated alpaca named Leroy to prove it. The FAA was surprisingly interested. But not in me. No, they asked me to send over the drone footage, then politely informed me Karen was under investigation for multiple violations. Her perfect little HOA resume just got a big red flag. Now, here's where things start getting spicy. After the drone was downed, and Karen had sufficiently screeched her lungs raw about personal violations and impending arrests, I decided it was time to dig a little deeper. I headed to the far east end of the ranch, just past the creek bed. That's where the land survey markers had first popped up, and where my granddad used to say, "If anyone ever tries to steal from us, check the iron." I always thought he meant a gun. Turns out he meant something else entirely. I spent an hour with a metal detector, digging through dirt and weeds, and there it was, half buried, rusted, and still anchored in stone, a cast-iron plaque older than the state highway. I brushed off the grime and read the inscription. And that's when I realized. Karen and her HOA hadn't just crossed a line, they'd triggered a legal trap that had been waiting for over a century. The plaque was barely legible at first, its surface worn from a century of weather and mud, but after a little water and elbow grease, the words became clear. What I held wasn't just an old property marker. It was a legal statement chiseled into iron, the kind of thing my great-grandfather would have considered a final word in a land dispute. Dated 1923, the inscription outlined the terms of a private land covenant filed with the county. Any construction, permanent or semi-permanent, installed on the eastern perimeter of the Callahan Ranch without written consent from the property holder would trigger automatic forfeiture proceedings under the agreement, rendering the construction, and the land beneath it, subject to claim by the Callahan family. It even named the survey coordinates and made specific reference to easement law. I laughed so hard I scared a squirrel off the fence post. You see, my great-grandfather was a mean old buzzard with a talent for whiskey and a hatred for people who thought a suit gave them the right to take what they wanted. According to family lore, he once sued a railroad company for cutting across his fields without notice. They settled and gave him not only money but the right to file his own covenant. He did it out of spite, never thinking it would come in handy. And yet, here we were, almost exactly 100 years later, and some HOA president with a superiority complex had walked directly into it. I called Donna, my lawyer, and read her the whole plaque word for word. She told me to stay put and drove over herself with a magnifying glass, legal pad, and a pair of floral gardening gloves. We spent the next 3 hours pulling up county records, and sure enough, there it was. A copy of the original covenant, filed and stamped in the dusty old archives of the courthouse. Not only was it valid, it had never been challenged or rescinded. That meant it was still enforceable under property law. Donna grinned like she'd just found gold in a retirement home raffle. "They're so screwed," she said, scribbling notes like a woman possessed. "They didn't even run a proper title check before trenching. Classic HOA move. Lazy and arrogant." I nodded, still stunned by the sheer pettiness of my own bloodline. "So what now?" I asked. She didn't even look up. "We send them a registered letter. Certified. Let them hang themselves a little more while we prep for full forfeiture." The next day, the HOA got their first letter. I imagined Karen opening it while sipping her oat milk latte, expecting maybe a noise complaint or a request to remove a wind chime. Instead, she found a certified notice of violation under covenant #1923-41A, complete with coordinates, legal citations, and a formal demand to cease operations and dismantle all equipment immediately, or risk a full land claim lawsuit. That should have been the moment she backed down. But of course this was Karen. Backing down wasn't in her vocabulary. Instead, she posted a fiery screed in the HOA newsletter accusing me of rural bullying, anti-progress sentiment, and weaponizing outdated legal documents to undermine community wellness. My favorite part was the phrase, "rogue landowner with a vendetta against solar energy." Donna laughed so hard she nearly dropped her tea. She told me not to worry. Karen was just making noise to save face. "Let her dig," she said. "The deeper the hole, the more dirt we'll have to bury her case." And dig she did. That week, the HOA board doubled down. They sent in more workers, brought in more panels, started trenching even further into the soil. I made sure to film every second of it from multiple angles. Even Leroy the alpaca got roped into the operation. I strapped a GoPro to his halter and let him roam the edge of the grid while eating weed. Best footage I've ever seen. They ignored every warning, every notice. Karen even sent me a smug little email with a winking emoji saying, "Hope you enjoy the shade." Then came the drone. Again. After I shot the first one down, you'd think she'd get the message. But no. Karen bought another one. Bigger, fancier, with a camera that could probably see through walls, and sent it buzzing over my ranch like an angry wasp. This time, I didn't shoot it. I waved. Because this time, I wanted the footage. I had already set up a wide-angle security cam on my roof and another one by the barn. I caught the drone flying under the 50-foot limit, weaving near the house, dipping close to the horses. All of it time-stamped, all of it saved. Karen was digging her grave with every paranoid little flight. When the FAA called me back, their investigator didn't even sound surprised. Drone violations in residential areas were common, but flying it repeatedly over private property without consent and filming livestock and humans? That crossed multiple lines. Especially in an agricultural zone. Karen had violated not only state drone privacy laws but federal aviation regulation. And she'd posted the footage publicly on her Facebook page with hashtags like #HOAStrong and #ThisLandIsOurLand. That part made the FAA guy laugh. He told me she might be looking at fines, license revocation, and possible criminal charges depending on how the investigation went. I thanked him politely and hung up, already picturing Karen in court trying to explain how a drone, accidentally, filmed my niece sunbathing on the porch. But the cherry on top came the following day. I received a letter from the HOA, not from Karen, but from the board. Apparently, several members were starting to question her leadership. The solar grid had gone wildly over budget, neighbors were complaining about the noise, and now the HOA was facing a potential lawsuit over land violations. The letter was trying to be diplomatic, asking if I'd be open to a community resolution. I framed it and hung it in the barn bathroom. That same evening, just as I was fixing a leak in the chicken coop roof, I noticed something odd: new workers arriving. But they weren't with the solar crew. These guys were from a surveying company. I watched from behind the woodpile as they walked the trench lines with scanners and tripods, marking something in chalk. Then I heard one of them on the phone. "Yeah, it's definitely beyond the boundary. That's a problem." That's when I realized the HOA might have just figured out how badly they'd screwed up. It wasn't just about the solar panels anymore. It wasn't even about the drone or Karen's nonsense Facebook crusade. They'd installed infrastructure, wiring, cement posts, trench work, deep into land they didn't own. Land that my family had legally locked up tighter than Fort Knox since the Great Depression. And under the covenant law, that meant more than just removing their toys. It meant damages. It meant restitution. It meant that everything they built could now legally become mine. I watched the surveyors pack up, one of them shaking his head and muttering something about lawsuit. I couldn't help but grin. Karen had declared war with a drone and a delusion of power. What she didn't realize was that the battlefield had been prepared long before she ever bought her first HOA sweatshirt. And now, the trap was closing. I didn't just have the law on my side, I had history. I had documentation. And best of all, I had patience. Because I knew what was coming next. The real fun hadn't even started. The town meeting was supposed to be a routine formality. A little damage control, a few polite questions, maybe Karen would cry on cue and wrap everything up with a "let's all move forward as neighbors" speech. What actually happened was closer to a courtroom drama directed by a vengeful coyote with a law degree and a flair for public humiliation. I didn't plan to speak. I figured my cease and desist letter and the quiet but effective FAA complaint would speak for me. But then Karen opened her mouth and basically dared me to ruin her evening. The community center was packed. Pine Ridge had never had this many residents attend anything that didn't involve free wine or a bounce house. Karen stood up front with her clipboard, fake pearls, and that smug little expression like she'd just walked off the set of a political thriller where she was the misunderstood genius. "As many of you know," she began, "there have been some unfortunate rumors circulating about the solar project and our good faith efforts to improve the community. I'd like to address those, clarify a few legal misunderstandings, and most importantly, reaffirm our shared commitment to progress." What she failed to mention, of course, was that progress had involved trenching half an acre into my ranch without permission, violating 3 state drone laws, and triggering a century-old covenant that now had the legal power of a freight train headed straight for her career in petty governance. I stayed silent, just watched from the back row with my arms crossed, waiting. Then Karen did something bold. She pulled out a printout of my cease and desist letter and held it up like she was unveiling a dead rat. "This document," she said, "is a perfect example of the kind of obstructionism we've faced. Instead of embracing a cleaner future, some people would rather cling to outdated claims and conspiracy theories to hold back the community." That was it. I stood up. Slowly. People turned. Phones came out. Donna, sitting beside me in her cardigan and orthopedic shoes, just smiled and whispered, "Go get him, cowboy." I walked to the front and asked to respond. Karen looked startled, then nervous. I cleared my throat and said, "Let's get something straight. I didn't send that letter to hold anyone back. I sent it because your board approved construction on land you didn't own, without permission, and you've ignored every legal attempt to stop it. That's not progress. That's trespass." You could feel the energy in the room shift. A few murmurs, some hushed conversations. Karen tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand and continued. "You didn't even check the title lines. You didn't consult a surveyor. You sent work crews onto land that has been in my family for 5 generations. And here's the kicker, your solar grid? It's now built directly over a land covenant filed in 1923, which states that any unauthorized construction on my eastern boundary defaults to my family's ownership. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's law." Someone from the back shouted, "Is that true?" Another person added, "She never mentioned any of that in the last meeting." Karen's face flushed red, her mouth opening and closing like a trout trying to recite the Constitution. "That covenant is ancient," she said weakly. "There's no way it's enforceable." I pulled a copy of the county filing from my coat and held it up. filed, stamped, and untouched since the day it was created. Your project violated every clause. And under that agreement, I now have the right to claim everything built within those boundaries, including the solar panels, trench work, and any structures. In other words, you gifted me free infrastructure. The silence that followed was the kind of silence people usually reserve for the moment after a magician saws someone in half. A few residents looked at each other in shock. One elderly man whispered something to his wife, and she nodded grimly. A woman in a tracksuit with 3 Yorkie stickers on her phone stood up and asked, "Karen, is this true?" Karen fumbled, said something about pending legal review and community priorities, but it was too late. The room had turned. By the time I walked back to my seat, half the board looked like they were planning an escape route. The next morning, things got worse, for Karen anyway. Someone leaked my speech. It hit the Pine Ridge Facebook group first, then made it to the local subreddit. The footage of Karen holding my letter and calling it obstructionist was especially popular, particularly when paired with the clip of me calmly outlining her legal disaster like I was narrating a true crime documentary. The comments were vicious. My personal favorite: "Can't believe we let this woman organize the Christmas fair if she can't read a property line." Within days, I started getting messages from HOA residents, people I'd never met, offering apologies, asking questions, or trying to figure out how to get their dues refunded. Apparently, the solar project had been sold as a zero-cost community improvement, but now everyone realized they might be on the hook for damages. One guy emailed me asking if I could recommend a good lawyer. I forwarded him Donna's number. Karen, on the other hand, doubled down again. She issued a public statement blaming a coordinated smear campaign led by an anti-environmentalist landowner and claimed she had evidence of harassment. That evidence turned out to be the footage of me waving at her drone. Ironically, that same footage was now in the hands of the FAA, who contacted me again asking for an official statement as part of their investigation. They were also very interested in the footage from my barn cams, especially the part where the drone hovered 10 feet above my niece, who was reading a book in a lawn chair. That, apparently, crossed another legal line: child privacy. At that point, Karen didn't just have civil lawsuits to worry about, she might be facing criminal charges. The HOA board tried to quietly hold a vote of no confidence, but Karen caught wind of it and tried to preempt them with a letter declaring she would temporarily step down due to the emotional toll of constant attacks. Nobody bought it. The board voted anyway. 3 days later, I got a call from one of the members, a guy named Dennis who always looked like he was trying to remember where he left his keys. He told me, very sheepishly, that Karen had been officially removed and that the board wanted to meet with me in good faith. I told him I'd think about it, because at that point I was already talking to Donna about damages. The original covenant didn't just give us forfeiture rights, it gave us the ability to claim losses, legal fees, and restoration costs. That solar grid wasn't just an eyesore anymore. It was $1 million liability. I had done the math, and if things continued in my favor, I could potentially walk away with full ownership of the installation, financial restitution, and the satisfaction of watching Karen's legacy dissolve like sugar in the rain. But just when I thought things had reached peak ridiculous, a new twist dropped into my lap. A county assessor, one of the ones involved in the recent land survey Karen had quietly ordered, called me to confirm boundary adjustments for the grid. Confused, I asked why they were confirming anything. The guy sounded nervous. Because someone from the HOA filed a form requesting a zoning variance for that land. Claimed it was HOA-owned communal property. Said it had been donated. My blood ran cold. That wasn't just a lie. That was fraud. Karen had submitted falsified documents to the county, claiming my land had been transferred. She didn't just overstep. She tried to erase me from the records entirely. I thanked the assessor and hung up. The meeting, the FAA, the lawsuit, those were just the warm-up acts. Karen had crossed a line no spreadsheet or HOA clause could fix. And now I was done playing defense. The thing about a trap is, it only works if the other side doesn't see it coming. And Karen had been so blinded by her own imagined authority that she didn't just step into the trap, she did a full swan dive with fireworks and a marching band. I could have stopped her earlier. I could have waved a white flag, taken a payoff, or just let it slide and gone back to baling hay. But this wasn't just about land anymore. It was about principle. About entitlement. About someone thinking they could erase 100 years of legacy with a zoning form and a drone. So I let the trap spring. And I made damn sure it held. By the end of the week, I had everything I needed. Documentation of the covenant, video proof of the solar grid trespassing, FAA statements regarding the drone harassment, even a notarized transcript of the county assessor's call where he confirmed Karen submitted fraudulent property documents. Donna filed the lawsuit like she was lighting a ceremonial bonfire. It wasn't just a cease and desist anymore. It was a full claim. Restitution for property damage, land forfeiture, recovery of utility infrastructure, punitive damages for legal violations, and civil penalties for drone surveillance and attempted fraud. When I saw the final number on the filing paperwork, I had to sit down and whistle. Karen and her HOA owed me just shy of 7 figures, assuming the court didn't get creative and pile on more for fun. But the real fun came when the letters hit their mailboxes. Karen didn't take it well. She posted one final, rambling manifesto to the HOA Facebook group, accusing me of being a land-grabbing, sovereign citizen, and claiming that the real conspiracy was orchestrated by Big Oil to destroy clean energy in their community. It would have been hilarious if it wasn't so sad. Her supporters, what few remained, quickly vanished once the legal language started getting serious. Nobody wanted to risk being named as a co-defendant. The rest of the HOA residents were too busy scrambling to figure out what this meant for their monthly dues and the failing solar project they had unknowingly bankrolled. Within 2 weeks, the board formally disbanded the solar committee. The contractors pulled out. Trucks started showing up to dismantle the solar panels, remove the wiring, and fill in the trenches. Everything came apart like a cheap toy at a yard sale. I didn't lift a finger. They paid for their mistake with sweat, tears, and more than a few destroyed reputations. Meanwhile, I stood on my porch every morning with a cup of coffee, watching them reverse engineer their own disaster. Occasionally I'd wave. One worker gave me a thumbs up. Said he hoped I got the whole system once it was cleared. I told him that was the plan. Then came the hearings. Karen tried to play the victim. Said she'd been misled by inaccurate maps, and that she had never intended to harm or harass anyone. But under questioning, her emails told a different story. The one where she explicitly instructed the surveyors to ignore the Callahan Ranch complaints and greenlight the project regardless of local pushback. The judge was not impressed. Even less impressed when he reviewed the drone footage. At one point, he paused the video, leaned forward, and asked Karen if she could explain why her drone was zooming in on a teenage girl sunbathing behind a private residence. Karen stuttered something about safety inspections. The courtroom laughed. The judge didn't. She was fined. Heavily. The FAA added their own penalties. The county revoked her ability to file or oversee any zoning project. And, just for good measure, the court ordered her to issue a formal apology, in writing, to my family for violating the covenant and for attempting to seize property under false pretenses. I didn't even care about the apology. I just liked the idea that she'd have to put it in writing. It felt like poetic justice in Times New Roman. But the part that truly sealed the deal was the land. Once the court ruled in our favor, the eastern strip of the HOA land, the part where the grid had been installed, was officially deeded over to me. It wasn't huge, maybe a couple of acres, but it was legally mine now. And it came with freshly cleared trenching, solar-ready infrastructure, and a story that would be told at every county barbecue for the next decade. I decided to build a barn on it. Not because I needed another one, but because I could. and because I wanted the first thing Karen saw every time she drove past to be a bright red monument to her own failure. The mural was Dale's idea. He's a decent mechanic but a hell of a painter when you give him enough time and energy drink. On the east-facing wall of the new barn, he painted a cartoon version of Karen's drone, exploding in a fiery blaze of glory, with the words "Property of the Callahan Ranch" stenciled underneath in 10-foot letters. It was subtle, but effective. I named the building the Trap House, not because I thought anyone would get the joke, but because I knew Karen would. The last I heard, she sold her house at a loss and moved 2 towns over. Word has it she's trying to join another HOA board, but her reputation precedes her. A few neighbors reached out to thank me. One even brought a homemade pie. Said the whole mess had made them realize how toxic the HOA had become. Some even talked about voting to dissolve it entirely. I told them that was their business. I'd done my part. I had my land, my barn, and the last word. As for the solar panels, Donna found a way for me to claim them through a legal salvage clause. I contacted a local co-op, got the wiring reconfigured, and set them up to power the new barn, part of my main house, and even sell a little extra back to the grid. Irony tasted better when it came with a government rebate and lower electric bills. The final scene played out on a windy Tuesday. I was sitting on the porch again, this time with Donna. She had her knitting needles out and was working on a scarf that looked like it was strangling a raccoon. We watched as the last of the grid workers drove away, leaving behind nothing but fresh soil, a new fence line, and my shiny new solar panels glinting in the sun. She looked over at me and said, "You could have just yelled at them, you know." I sipped my coffee and nodded. Sure. But where's the fun in that? We sat there a little longer, listening to the wind whistle through the grass. The ranch was quiet again. Peaceful. And best of all, it was mine. Every inch of it, earned through patience, planning, and the kind of generational spite that only a Callahan could carry. They thought they were building a monument to progress. But all they did was trigger a 100-year-old reminder that some land doesn't take kindly to being claimed. And some families don't forget.